I'm Commander Rachel Evans. That title means something in the halls where I work. It opens doors, turns heads, and earns respect in rooms where precision and pressure rule every decision. But at home, around the people who've known me since I was a kid, I'm just Rachel, the single niece with a strange job, the one who never really fit into the family mold. Thanksgiving's in 2 days. It's the same routine every year, everyone gathering at my uncle's place in Maryland. He's the kind of man who still wears cufflinks to a backyard barbecue and expects his guests to do the same. My cousin will be there, of course. The lawyer, the pride of the family, with stories of firm wins and weekend golf trips. My aunts will buzz about holiday recipes, my uncle will hold court like a CEO, and I'll sit quietly near the window, trying not to shrink into the wallpaper. No one asks much about my work. When they do, it's more curiosity than interest, like asking a zookeeper about feeding times. I've learned to keep things vague. Still in the Navy, I say, even though the reality is far more complicated. I've stopped correcting the way they tell my story. According to my uncle, I signed up for the Navy in my 20s, gave it a try, and then pivoted to admin work. Cute, right? I used to think it didn't matter, that it wasn't worth it to correct people who had already made up their minds. But something about this year feels different. Maybe I'm tired of being invisible. Maybe I'm finally ready for the truth to take up some space. My uncle's house looks exactly the same every Thanksgiving. Big brick exterior, spotless floors, and a fireplace that roars just a little too loudly, like it's trying to drown out conversation. The table stretches across the dining room, crowded with food and stories that have aged better in some mouths than others. Jake, my cousin, arrives with his fiancée and that casual air of someone who knows he's the star. Everyone stands to greet him. My uncle launches into a monologue about Jake's latest courtroom victory before he even takes his coat off. There's clapping. Actual clapping. You'd think the man cured cancer. I walk in 5 minutes later. No fanfare. No questions. Just a nod from my aunt and a half-hearted, "Oh, you made it." I put my coat on the rack and slid into the background like a guest who forgot to RSVP. It's always like this. Jake talks about his job at the firm, and people hang on his every word. They laugh in all the right places, ask follow-up questions, and offer wine refills. He mentions a judge who complimented his strategy, and my uncle beams like, he just won Father of the Year. I say I just got back from DC. Someone says, "Oh, still doing that Navy thing?" I nod. That's the end of the conversation. At some point, my military service becomes a punchline. My uncle tells the same story he's told for years, that I joined the Navy on a whim and left after a few months when I realized it was too intense. He says it with a chuckle, like he's reminiscing about a kid who once wanted to be an astronaut. Nobody corrects him, not even my mother. The room laughs lightly, enough to sting but not enough to call out. I sip my wine and stare at the centerpiece. It's some combination of pumpkins and fake leaves, perfectly arranged. Like everything else in this house, it's designed to impress, but not to feel. Someone asks if I still wear a uniform. I say yes. They smiled as I told them I still play dress-up. I've worn that uniform in war zones. I've made life and death decisions. I've briefed admirals and managed entire operations. But here, I'm just Rachel. The one who tried something once and quit. The worst part isn't the lies. It's how they've become tradition. They're as expected as the cranberry sauce and the dry turkey. Every year, I tell myself it won't bother me. Every year, it does. I think what hurts most is that they're not mean. Not directly. They just chose the easier version of me. The one who doesn't challenge their narrative. The one who stays quiet and lets the room keep spinning. I started at the Naval Academy when I was 20. It wasn't a childhood dream or some legacy move. I just knew I needed something real. Something that demanded more of me than the world I came from ever did. The first year nearly broke me. Not because I couldn't handle the academics or the training, but because it was the first time I'd been surrounded by people who all had something to prove. I kept my head down, learned quickly, and listened more than I spoke. After graduation, I was assigned to a logistics unit that supported operations overseas. My job wasn't glamorous. It didn't come with action movie scenes or medals they hand out in parades. I coordinated shipments, scheduled routes, and tracked movement down to the minute. We moved fuel, food, ammunition, and personnel. If it didn't arrive on time, people got hurt. Eventually, I was promoted. I led teams that oversaw strategic transport across volatile regions. Sometimes that meant arguing with higher-ups about timing and terrain. Sometimes it meant sleeping in a cot next to a laptop, knowing a delay of even 10 minutes could throw off a mission. I've made calls that saved lives. Even if those lives never knew my name, I shifted into operations and intel not long after that. It was a quieter job, but heavier in a different way. I'd spend 12 hours reviewing satellite data or scanning communication logs. I learned to find patterns, to see what others missed. It was the kind of work that didn't come with stories I could bring home, and most of it is still classified. These days, I work out of the Pentagon. I lead a division that handles joint force coordination between departments most people haven't heard of. I brief generals. I approve plans. I sign off on a movement that affects thousands of troops. And still, to my family, I'm just the niece who couldn't hack it. I never told them what I really do, not because I was ashamed or because I didn't want them to be proud, but because I could see in their eyes they had already decided what my story was. They didn't ask for details. They didn't want the truth. They wanted a version of me that fit into their comfort zone. I stopped bringing up work after a while. It felt easier, like saving breath in a room with no oxygen. I told myself it didn't matter, that the respect of people who understand the job meant more. But sometimes, especially around the holidays, the silence gets loud. I've spent over a decade in service. I've been the youngest in the room, the only woman in the room, and sometimes the only one willing to say what no one else would. I've been wrong, I've been right, and I've been responsible for decisions that never make headlines but change outcomes all the same. None of that shows up in family photo albums. You won't hear it over dinner, but it's mine, and it's real. It happened just as dessert was being served. The doorbell rang, sharp and unexpected, cutting through the low hum of conversation and the clink of silverware. My aunt wiped her hands on a dish towel and disappeared down the hallway. When she came back, a man followed behind her, tall, composed, in a dark overcoat that looked expensive but not flashy. He carried a tin of cookies and a slight smile, the kind that doesn't try too hard. My aunt said, "Everyone, this is James. He works with Rachel." Heads turned. I stayed seated, my fork frozen mid-air. My uncle stepped in quickly, ever the host, clapping the man on the back and saying something like, "You must work with Jake, right? He's in corporate law, defense contracts, maybe there's some overlap." James didn't correct him. He just nodded once and said, "I've known someone in the family for quite some time." He said it simply. No need for drama. But I saw the shift. His eyes scanned the room like he'd done it 100 times in more serious places. He took everything in, quietly, where people sat. Who held the attention? Who didn't? He declined wine, thanked them for the invite, and made his way toward a seat near the fireplace. I could feel the questions rising in the room, but no one asked them. Not yet. He didn't speak much, but when he did, people listened. Even my uncle, who normally dominated every space, seemed to pause a beat longer before replying. I sat back and watched. My heart didn't race, but it did steady itself. This wasn't planned, but it also didn't feel like an accident. The cranberry sauce had just made its third trip around the table when it happened. My uncle, fueled by wine and his usual sense of humor, leaned back in his chair and said, "Rachel tried the Navy once, remember that?" Lasted a few months before realizing she wasn't cut out for it. He laughed, looking around for confirmation, like he always did. I didn't flinch. I never do. My eyes stayed on my plate, the same defense I'd rehearsed for years. But this time, before anyone could chuckle or change the subject, James set his glass down with a quiet, deliberate movement. "With all due respect, sir," he said, voice calm and even. "She didn't quit. She leads my division at the Pentagon." The room froze. No one spoke. No one moved. It was like the air itself had been sucked out of the space. My uncle blinked slowly, his mouth parting just slightly, as if trying to replay what he'd just heard. Across the table, forks hovered mid-air. Eyes darted between James and me as we had just pulled off a magic trick no one saw coming. James didn't elaborate. He didn't have to. The sentence stood on its own, sharp and clear. There was nothing defensive about it. No need to raise his voice. Just truth, dropped into the center of the table like a stone into still water. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything I had ever carried in that room. My aunt cleared her throat but didn't speak. Jake stared at me like he was seeing me for the first time. I didn't move. I didn't smile. I just sat there, steady, while the old story shattered on the hardwood floor. No one reached for their drink. No one reached for a second helping of pie. The sound of the furnace kicking on in the hallway felt louder than anything else in the room. My uncle stayed frozen, one hand on his wine glass, the other gripping the back of his chair. His face didn't show anger or embarrassment, just confusion, like someone had swapped out the ending to a story he'd told too many times to remember where it even started. Jake looked at me. Not smug, not competitive, just stunned. His eyes were searching, maybe for proof, maybe for some hint that this was all just a misunderstanding. My mother, quiet for most of the night, now sat straighter, eyes flicking between James and me like she had questions but didn't know how to ask them out loud. I pushed my chair back slowly, not to make a statement, not for applause, just because something in me told me it was time to stand. My body felt heavy, like it had been waiting for permission it never knew it needed. I didn't clear my throat or fix my posture. I didn't scan the room to see if anyone was there. I just stood there, fully, quietly. For the first time in that house, I took up space without apology. James didn't say another word. He didn't look to me for support or acknowledgement. He just stood in quiet solidarity, the kind that doesn't need a speech to mean something. He let the silence do the work, and the silence did work. It carved out space that had never existed before. It pulled the rug out from under a narrative that had gone unchecked for years. And in that space, something real settled in. Not pride exactly, something deeper, like clarity, or maybe peace. No one clapped, no one toasted, no one tried to change the subject. They just sat there, holding the weight of a truth that had finally been named. I didn't say thank you. James didn't need it. What he did wasn't about loyalty or defense. It was about putting something right that had stayed wrong for too long. And the beauty of it was, he didn't do it to rescue me. He did it because it was the truth. I sat back down, slowly, not to signal the end of the moment, but to ground myself in it. My uncle looked at me, really looked, not as the niece who tried something once, but as someone he didn't actually know. And maybe, for the first time, I wanted to. That moment didn't fix everything. It didn't erase the years of being misunderstood. But it did something better. It ended the story. I never gave permission for anyone else to tell. The next morning, I found a quiet spot on the porch. The sky was overcast, and the cold slipped through the seams of my jacket, but it felt good to be outside. I sipped coffee from a chipped mug and listened to the wind move through the trees. My uncle stepped out a few minutes later. He didn't say anything at first, just sat down beside me, holding his own mug like it was something to do with his hands. We sat in silence, the kind that didn't press or demand. Eventually, he said, "I didn't know." His voice was low, almost like he was talking to himself. I filled in the gaps with what made sense to me. I didn't turn to look at him. I just nodded once and said, You never asked. The words weren't sharp. They were just true. He winced a little, like hearing them out loud stung more than he expected. I'm sorry, he said. No explanation, no excuses. Just those two words, sitting heavy between us. I let them sit. Then I said, I know. He nodded, eyes fixed on the trees. I didn't understand what you were doing. I thought if you couldn't talk about it, it didn't count. I said, some things matter whether or not they're talked about. He glanced at me, then looked away again. I'm proud of you, Rachel. Not because of the rank or the job, because you stuck with it. Because you didn't let any of us stop you. I didn't cry. But I felt something shift, like a door cracking open, just enough for light to come through. I said, thanks. And that was all either of us needed. Not every story needs an audience. Some of the hardest work gets done in silence, away from lights, applause, or even acknowledgement. Serving in the military taught me that real responsibility doesn't always look like heroism, that sometimes the deepest kind of pride is the kind you carry quietly. I used to think I needed my family to see me clearly, to understand what I'd done, what I'd built, what I'd sacrificed. But now, I think what I wanted more was to stop feeling erased. It's not about medals or titles. It's about knowing that your work matters, even if no one ever claps. And when someone finally sees it, even just one person, it can change something in you. My uncle hasn't brought up the old story again. He doesn't joke about me quitting. These days, when someone asks what I do, I just say, she works at the Pentagon. My niece serves our country. And somehow that's enough. Not because it makes up for everything, but because it's true. And sometimes, being seen even briefly, even quietly, is all you really need.